to our community. And he's had quite an illustrious, interesting career. He did his bachelor's degree at Hopkins, where he majored in English. And then his residency was spread out over Cornell, SUNY Downstate, and Minnesota. And then he went to MSK for his ID fellowship. He spent about 20 years at Muhlenberg Hospital, which no longer exists now, but he was rounding there doing ID consults. He spent about 10 years working for QualCare, which was an insurance company. And for the past 24-ish years, he has retired from clinical medicine, but has been really enjoying spending time educating medical students, residents. He was at Jersey Shore, St. Peter's, and he's also part of our clinical faculty. So today we had the pleasure of having Dr. Fisher give a talk about tuberculosis a couple of years ago. I think it was before Amy and Vishal came, so 2 years ago at least. And today he's going to be talking about syphilis. So without further ado, Dr. Fisher.
Thank you very much. I hope that I will live up to your expectations, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to do this. So I'm going to talk about syphilis, sex, and society because I think you'll hopefully find it as much fun as I have. I have no financial conflicts of interest relating to syphilis. And if I did, would I tell you? I'm not so sure. But in any case, I'm not an expert in art, and so the commentaries are all based on the expertise of real scholars. I'd like to discuss the emergence and geographic spread of syphilis, explain the origin and significance of the many names given to syphilis, review representations of syphilis in graphic and literary arts, describe the impact of syphilis on society and scientific inquiry. And I'll direct attention to a little bit about current treatment guidelines because of some issues that have come up within the last year or two. How do I justify this? Well, according to Sir William Osler, by the historical method alone, many problems in medicine can be approached profitably. I won't go through his whole quotation, but I think it's always useful to review the history of a disease. The impact of emerging diseases on current medicine and society suggests that there is value to understanding a disease that emerged in Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Understanding how syphilis emerged and spread may provide insights for the fight against modern epidemics, and we're seeing plenty of those. Some of the artist images are very explicit. So let me talk a little bit about the geographic origin and spread of syphilis. Non-syphilitic treponematoses, yaws and beetle, existed in the Old World prior to the time of Columbus, but not in continental Europe. Individual bony lesions are difficult to prove to be due to Treponema pallidum. The percentage of typical bony lesions in a population is used as evidence of one or another treponematosis. If it's in 20 to 40% of the population, one thinks of yaws and beetle. If it's in 2 to 13%, one thinks of syphilis. Now, I didn't make this up. Somebody else did. Population prevalence data such as these are interpreted to show that syphilis did not exist outside the New World prior to the arrival of Columbus. Yaws is believed to be the oldest treponemal disease. It probably originated in Africa. It passed through Asia to North America, spinning off a mutation, which I was taught to pronounce as Beetle, but some people pronounce it as Begel en route. Another mutation is believed to have taken place in North America, resulting in syphilis. Some milestones in the history of syphilis. Italy was not united in the late 15th century. You can see there are multiple political subdivisions, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, the Republic of Venice, many others. There were some papal states as well. As you can see, Sicily was its own kingdom, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and so on. In 1493, the year after Columbus left for America, Charles VIII of France, who was 23 years of age at the time, learned that there was a claim of inheritance for him on the Kingdom of Naples. And in order to enforce this claim, he hired an international mercenary force of 30,000 men. Ferdinand of Naples defended his realm, also using mercenaries, some of them from Barcelona, to which Columbus had sailed on returning from the New World. After 3 weeks, besieged troops surrendered and entered the service of Charles VIII. People mingled very closely and intensely. There were women camp followers who helped intensify venereal spread of syphilis. Infected troops marched northward, spreading this illness throughout Europe. So Europe owes syphilis really almost directly to Columbus. And this is just a map, I hope, yes. I hope that you can see that as they marched northward, they brought syphilis to parts of Europe where it had not been even thought of. It disseminated over the next couple of years. It was recognized as different from any other genital disease, and that it regularly spread to skin and vital organs, because ultimately, syphilis is a vasculitis. In 1508, Paracelsus introduced mercury as treatment, and it lasted for a long time. A little digression about the names for syphilis, which is felt to be the most disowned infection in history. The name syphilis itself is named after a mythical shepherd, and I'll show you the story that comes from in a little bit. When I was a medical student, we called it Louis. Not that I'm so old that we spoke Latin, but that was the name for it. It was called the Great Pox to compare it with smallpox. In England and Germany, it was called the French pox. In Russian, they called it the Polish sickness. In Poland, they called it the German sickness. In Italy and elsewhere in Europe, it was called morbus gallicus, or the French disease. And in France, it was called the Neapolitan sickness because of its connection with Naples. And in the rest of Italy, it was called the Mal de Naples. It was called the Mal de Castilla, the Spanish sickness in what we now would think of as Belgium, Holland, Portugal, and North Africa. In Japan, it was called the Canton rash, or the Chinese ulcer. And in Portuguese colonies in parts of Asia, it was known as the Portuguese disease. This is a very disowned disease. And this chronicle is documented in a journal called The Hospital. And I have this article from 1911. I didn't read it in its original, don't worry. But it talks about all of this in this article. It's a relatively short article, but very interesting. So you know I'm not making this up. Now back to the milestones in the history of syphilis. Girolamo Fracastoro was an Italian physician, poet, and scholar who was known for work in mathematics, geography, and astronomy. And he lived, as you see, in the 15th and early first half of the 16th century. And he wrote a poem called Syphilis sive morbus gallicus, or Syphilis, or the French disease, in 1530. It's about a shepherd boy whose name was Syphilis, who insulted the sun god. And he was punished with a horrible disease, which was found to be treatable with mercury and oil of guaiac. So the coining of the name syphilis goes back to Fracastoro in 1530. Same year, Paracelsus suggested it could be acquired congenitally. In the 16th century, secondary syphilis was very virulent with significant mortality in Europe. And in 1532, Nicolas Massat described neurologic and many other manifestations. Remember, this is a vasculitis, so there's hardly an organ it can't affect. In 1539, a huge milestone was met with the observation of the efficacy of high fever in arresting the progression of syphilis. This was first noted in Spain. And I'll come back to that because that has some implications 400 years later. Andrew Bourdet was a Briton from Sussex in the 16th century. And he wrote a work called the Breviary of Health. A breviary is a compendium or abridgment of Latin liturgical and canonical prayers. And Bourdet wrote a breviary of health for all manner, and this is his language, that's why it's spelled this way, for all manner of sicknesses and diseases, the which may be in man or woman, doth follow, expressing the obscure names of Greek, Arabic, Latin, and Barbary in English concerning physic and chirurgery, which means surgery. The author was an Oxford graduate, a monk then physician, and a continental traveler and ambassador. His Breviary of Health is the first book on medicine by a physician originally written in the English language. The main medical textbook for 600 years before that was by Avicenna or Ibn Sina, the Canon of Medicine, which was written in 1025 and translated from Arabic to Latin in the 12th century in Toledo, Spain. In this Breviary of Health, Bourda prescribes elements of sound medical education. There are 457 chapters alphabetically arranged. And here's a quote from it from 1547. In English, morbus gallicus is named the French pox. When that I was young, they were named the Spanish pox. I'm telling you, disowned. The which be of many kinds of the pox. Some be moist, some be waterish, some be dry, some be scurvy, some be like scabs, some be like ringworms, some fistuled, some festered, some cankerous, some like wens, a wen is a mole, some be like biles, or boils, some be like knobbles or burrs, some be ulcerous, having a little dry scab in the middle of the ulcerous scab, some hath ache in the joints, and no singe of the pox, and yet it may be the pox. The cause of these impediments or infirmities doth come many ways. It may come by lying in the sheets or bed, there where a pocky person had the night before lain. It may come with lying with a pocky person. It may come by sitting on a draught or sedge where a pocky person did lately sit. Think about that for environmental cleaning. It may come by drinking oft with a pocky person, but especially it is taken when one pocky person doth sin in lechery, the one with another. So it was known to be a venereal infection. Puritanical notions of decency reflected in dress codes of the 16th and 17th centuries, covering most of the body, were an attempt to change behavior to deter sex and syphilis. And this is a very famous portrait of Mistress Hester Tradescant. The closed linen cap, the tall hat, the unrevealing neckline, sober colors, long-fronted bodice, and the open skirt was considered conservative in her time. But these dress codes were meant to deter the spread of venereal diseases, and in particular syphilis. Later on, Valsalva, Morgagni, and others established the ability of syphilis to affect the liver, spleen, and kidneys. Again, it's a vasculitis. John Hunter, a Scot of the 18th century, one of the most distinguished scientists and surgeons of this time, addressed the question of whether syphilis and gonorrhea were the same or two distinct diseases. He believed that gonorrhea resulted from deposition of the germ on a secreting surface and syphilis from deposition on a non-secreting surface. To test this hypothesis, he inoculated the non-secreting surface, his skin, with pus from a patient with gonorrhea. Hunter did not know that that patient had simultaneous infections with syphilis and gonorrhea. He then developed syphilis, which ultimately killed him. For the next 50 years, it was thought that syphilis and gonorrhea had the same etiology. In the 19th century, syphilis was one of the commonest diseases in the United States and Europe. In urban areas, between 8 and 14% of the population was infected. In 1903, Metchnikoff, who later won a Nobel Prize for his work in phagocytosis, and Roux infected apes with syphilis, producing an animal model for study. In 1905, Treponema pallidum was identified by microscopy as the causative agent of syphilis by Schouden and Hoffman. The following year, Wasserman and colleagues developed a blood test, a complement fixation test for the diagnosis of syphilis. And even in my student years, we spoke of the Wasserman test. Dr. K may be a little younger than that. In 1910, salvarsan and arsenical was introduced by Paul Ehrlich, who also won a Nobel Prize for his work in immunity for the treatment of syphilis. And the following year, Noguchi grew Treponema pallidum in culture. These are just some data among World War I French soldiers. And it just shows that syphilis was probably more prevalent among them than gonorrhea and how they got it. Following World War I, the anti-venereal disease, anti-syphilis campaign reached its pinnacle with posters, pamphlets, press articles, and radio programs. In 1927, Wagner Jauregg received a Nobel Prize for pyrotherapy of syphilis. Now, I'll say more about this. The use of fever for the treatment of syphilis. This got him a Nobel Prize in 1927. In the 1930s, bank blood started to be screened for syphilis. In 1937, the Surgeon General of the United States made the following remarks. The danger to oneself and others of harboring syphilis without knowing it could be averted if everyone were to submit voluntarily to a Wasserman test, either in the course of a periodic health exam, which every intelligent person should have a good doctor give him at least once a year, or following suspected exposure. Some hospitals make the Wassermann test a regular procedure in the admission of all patients for every cause. All hospitals should do it. And indeed, Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, where I was a student, every patient, and Jewish Hospital in St. Louis also, every patient was tested with a Wassermann test on admission. Every patient. The vast majority were negative, but that was how it was done. Another milestone in the history of syphilis. Does anybody recognize this picture? It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. All right, I see some people are shaking their head no, so I'm glad I'm showing you this. One of the milestones in the history of syphilis was the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis, in their words, in the Negro male. Very, very important for us all to learn from. In 1932, a collaboration of the United States Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama studied 611 Black men, 411 with syphilis, 200 without it. The progression of untreated syphilis was measured, although subjects were told they were being treated. In 1934, papers began to be published regarding the health effects of untreated syphilis. And indeed, treatment was known at that time. This was a poster from the 30s that shows that there was effective treatment if they didn't wait too long. But these men were denied treatment as part of the study. Things like guaiac, salvarsan, mercurials, and to a certain extent, fever. In 1945, penicillin was accepted as a treatment of choice for syphilis. In 1947, the Public Health Service established rapid treatment centers for syphilis, but the men in the Tuskegee study were not treated. This is a picture of Peter Buxton, who, when he died, was written up in the New York Times, not only at the time that he died, but in the end of the year in 2024, there's an issue of notable people who died that year, and there was an article about Peter Buxton. Peter Buxton was a Public Health Service venereal disease investigator in San Francisco, and he contacted the Division of Venereal Diseases in writing with ethics concerned about the Tuskegee study. A great hero. And these are some of the data. It shows that the death rate, percentage-wise, was certainly greater among those with syphilis than the controls. In 1968, ethical questions about the study were raised within the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now known as Health and Human Services, for as long as it's going to last, I hope long. And a few years later, there were news articles condemning the study. It was terminated that year, 40 years after it began. This is an article from the New York Times in September of 1972, showing the mortality from the Tuskegee study. And indeed, another article the next day showing some of the horrible consequences and data. And later on, the Times published this article, and what they showed was a panel that recommended that Congress establish a permanent board to regulate at least all federally supported research involving human subjects. And it just shows that the mortality among those that had syphilis that were not treated was high. 1973, there were congressional hearings and a class action suit on behalf of the study participants. The following year, there was a $10 million out-of-court settlement, and the US government promised lifetime medical benefits and burial services to all living participants. In the following year, widows, wives, and offspring were added to the program. In 1997, Clinton apologized on behalf of the nation, 29 years after the study was terminated. And in 1999, Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics and Research and Healthcare had its first annual commemoration of the presidential apology. In 2001, the President's Council on Bioethics was established. It took a long time. In 2004, the last study participant died, and 5 years later, the last widow receiving Tuskegee Health Benefit programs died. 77 years after the beginning of the study, and 41 years after the termination of the study. And this is a very important slide. Current principles and practices of informed consent stem, at least in part, directly from the Tuskegee study. I'm sure you've interacted with the Institutional Review Board at this hospital, and that entity is a direct result of the Tuskegee study. Doesn't get much more important. In the World War II years, syphilis peaked in the United States. Penicillin was introduced shortly afterward. I'll go into the Guatemala study in a minute. In the late 1980s, it peaked again, this time due to crack cocaine and HIV use, HIV consequences. And in the early 2020s, it's peaking again. And I'll show you those data in a little bit. The Guatemala study was an NIH-funded study to determine the impact of penicillin on prevention and treatment of venereal diseases. It involved the intentional infection of 1,500 soldiers, prisoners, prostitutes, and psychiatric patients with syphilis and other venereal diseases. It was led by a U.S. physician participant in the Tuskegee study. There was a formal apology from the United States in 2010, 62 years after the study was terminated. It's interesting, I talk about the impact of this disease on history. Let me show you some famous people that had syphilis. Cortez, the explorer, conquistador, Cellini, the sculptor and painter, John Hunter probably, Hoffmann, Schopenhauer, the philosopher, Heinrich Heine, Semmelweis, Baudelaire, Flaubert, Edouard Manet, I'll show you a cartoon in a little bit, and many others, Nietzsche, Maupassant, Oscar Wilde, and Al Capone, all had syphilis. As far as musicians, it is thought perhaps that Beethoven had syphilis. I don't know if that's been proven. But Paganini, the greatest violinist to ever live, probably had syphilis. Schubert, Donizetti, Mikhail Glinka, Schumann, Smetana, Chabrier, Hugo Wolf, and Delius all had syphilis. And as far as people who ran countries, Charles VIII of France, Henry VIII of England, no big surprise, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Louis XIV of France, and Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, all had syphilis. With regard to Henry VIII, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, bore him 4 children, all stillborn or who died shortly after birth. His fifth wife, later known as Bloody Mary, had thin, moth-eaten hair, protruding forehead, bad eyesight, all signs of congenital syphilis. And Henry VIII's delusions of grandeur and irritable inconsistencies have been attributed to neurosyphilis. Of course, we don't know that for sure. Graphic representations in the arts are extraordinary. Again, I'm no expert, but I have this collection that I like to call the Bruce Museum. This was a sign on Route 95, which doesn't exist anymore, but I couldn't resist it. An unidentified artist in Peru in the 4th century had this sculpture of a syphilitic mother with child, and the mother has signs of congenital syphilis, a depressed nasal bridge, and upper central incisors notched at the free margin, so-called Hutchinsonian teeth, 4th century Peru. Albrecht Dürer, who we know for his painting of the praying hands, had a painting called Syphilitic Man in 1496. It's the earliest known depiction of an individual suffering from syphilis. The zodiac sign above his head symbolizes astrological influence. 1484 represented a year with ill-boding astrological conjunction causing, in their opinion, the epidemic in Europe. This man had multiple chancres, and by the attire, he's identified as a Landsknecht, a type of mercenary. So he circulated around. I'm not going to even try to pronounce this name, Bartholomeus Steber, a French school, late 15th century, treatment of a syphilitic couple with mercury balm. It's the earliest known medical illustration of patients with syphilis. It was in 1498, the couple is covered with pustules. One doctor examines a flask of urine, while the other uses a spatula to apply what may be mercury to the man's leg. And this was from the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases, so it must be okay. Il Bronzino was a very famous painter in Italy in the 16th century, and he has this painting called An Allegory with Venus and Cupid. Venus and Cupid. Venus and Cupid. Symbols of male and female sexuality. Father Time is exposing the scene. Oblivion Missing eyes and brain, perhaps symbolic of general paresis of the insane, trying to hide it. And I'll show you a couple of closer ups. This is a figure in the left mid background, right here. Pulling out his hair with alopecia areata and possible gumma of his palate with missing teeth, perhaps from mercury poisoning. And look here. Figure in the right mid background, stepping on a thorn, yet euphoric. You'd never know he was stepping on a form. Probably because he has decreased sensation from tabes dorsalis. Rembrandt, from the Netherlands in the 17th century, has this portrait of Gérard de Larresse. He was himself a painter born in Liège, and he has the nasal deformity, probably from congenital syphilis, and he ultimately became blind and then devoted himself to philosophy and not painting. Juan Carreño de Miranda, a Spanish of the 17th century, has this portrait of Carlos II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. Several generations of his ancestors had syphilis. It is believed that inbreeding and syphilis ended the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. He had keratitis, eighth nerve deafness, and Hutchinsonian teeth, which you can't see in this picture. Most of his teeth and hair fell out. He had separating skin ulcers. At autopsy, he had what were thought to be stones in his liver, but were probably gummata. He was a late walker and had a staggering gait, perhaps from tabes dorsalis. Luca Giordano, an Italian of the late 17th century, has this painting called An Allegory of Syphilis. And I emphasize this individual. This is syphilis, the individual who offended the sun god. He has alopecia of the scalp, crusted papules, which you can't really see on this slide. The bridge of his nose is flat, and he is identified as syphilis in the poem by Fracastaro. And this just shows you what alopecia from syphilis looks like today. Pretty similar. Stephen Blanckaert, a Dutchman of the late 17th century, has this piece of art called The Siege of Venus at Onset. The patient in the left foreground has a jar of mercury ointment with a larger jar to measure salivary outlet, because absorbed mercury increased salivation. And mercury rubs and frictions were prescribed for 15 to 30 days. Optimal salivary output, in fact, was felt to be 1.7 liters per day. That's a lot of saliva. Also shown is vaporization of mercury sulfide for inhalation. William Hogarth, an Englishman from the 18th century. He is recognized as the father of English painting. He became famous for narrative morality pieces. His compositions ridiculed the vices of his time. And he had one set of illustrations called The Harlot's Progress. There were 6 paintings that were destroyed by fire. Engravings were made that were available in 1732. They were so often pirated that the Copyright Act of 1735 arose in part due to Hogarth's efforts, another influence of syphilis on society. And the 6 paintings show the harlot ensnared by a procuress. She quarrels with her protector. She's apprehended by a magistrate. There's a scene of her in prison. She returns to the life of degradation, is destitute, and dies while doctors are fighting about who actually killed her, and then the expensive funeral arranged by her colleagues. And this is the first plate. This is the harlot newly arrived in London by wagon from York, sweet and innocent, 16 years of age. Her father is paying the fare. The older woman perhaps has a facial rash, offers introduction to the high life of easy virtue. And people who were alive in those days recognized these individuals who were lechers as members of parliament. Plate 5, after she returns to her old life, destitution, disease, complete her degradation. She dies in abject poverty. 2 quacks argue whose medicine was less responsible for her death, and a prescription and a box of pills, anti-syphilitic pills probably, are on the floor. In another set of plates by him, by Hogarth, Marriage a la Mode, it depicts the dissolution of the doomed marriage between a viscount and a rich merchant's daughter. And the next slide probably shows a venereal disease, almost certainly syphilis. The viscount's venereal disease is shown by the black spot on his neck, Hogarth's symbol for treatment with mercury. Viscount's young mistress has her eyes downcast, bringing a handkerchief to her face. 3 black pills in the Viscount's box are probably a mercurial, and the woman in the red dress has a facial rash, probably syphilis. Lucien Rops, a Belgian from the 19th century, had this drawing called Mors Syphilitica, the jaws of syphilis. Make a long story short, he illustrates the Grim Reaper as a prostitute in a doorway as a source of evil and deadly disease. Christian Krogh, a Norwegian, more recent, a very, very famous painting that I never heard of until I prepared this talk, called Albertine at the Police Doctor's Waiting Room. It's an artist illustration for his novel Albertine, characterizing the lot of a contemporary prostitute. She's escorted by a policeman to the doctor's office for compulsory venereal disease exam. Albertine was banned the day after publication, but popular outrage stopped compulsory VD exams. And indeed, this painting is in the National Museum in Oslo because the artist was Norwegian. Toulouse-Lautrec, the Frenchman, has this painting, Medical Inspection at the Rue des Moulins. Brothel workers file past a faceless doctor in an orderly line, and it depicts their hopeless disinterest and weary resignation. Edvard Munch. We all know Edvard Munch because of The Scream, which is one of my favorite paintings because it has to do with tuberculosis. Another story. And here's a painting that Munch painted called The Inheritance. It shows infantile wasting with extreme pallor, except for the rash that he has. You can hardly see him against the white blanket. The facial rash on the mother is due to secondary syphilis. Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Originally titled The Brothel of Avignon, the name was changed to lessen its scandalous impact on the public. It portrays 5 nude female prostitutes from a brothel in Barcelona. And this painting is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So you know I'm not making this up. The US military had prevention publicity exemplified by this poster telling soldiers to fight syphilis and gonorrhea, avoid exposure, avoid pickups and prostitutes. If exposed, use prophylaxis. If infected, see a medical officer. Penicillin wasn't the norm yet, but they felt you had to do something. And I have been subscribing to the New Yorker for 53 years. Danny Shanahan had this cartoon, and the caption says, I suppose it was very sweet and old-fashioned of him, but still, it was syphilis. Harry Bliss, another New Yorker cartoonist. This woman is in a museum, and she said, I said, was it Manet or Monet who had syphilis? It was Manet, by the way. Literary references to syphilis. Shakespeare. This is very, very interesting. Shakespeare was more preoccupied with sexually transmitted diseases than his contemporaries. One of them, Christopher Marlowe, in 7 plays, has 6 lines that refer to venereal infection. Shakespeare, in 3 plays, has 183 lines referring to venereal infection. Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, and Timon of Athens are among them. Syphilis was widespread in England in the 16th century. In 1548, 24% of the patients at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in England had syphilis. In 1579, up to 75% of patients in this hospital had the French pox. It was more contagious and more severe in the 16th century than it is at present. The term syphilis was not very prevalent in Shakespeare's England. What he called it was the pox, the malady of France, the infinite malady, the incurable bone ache, the horror leprosy. Horror means gray, but of course we know what else it means. So it was a pun. And the good year, which was a pun on the French gougère, from rouge, which meant prostitute. In Henry IV, Falstaff makes several references to the pox. And this is very anachronistic because although Shakespeare knew about syphilis from his own time, Henry IV took place hundreds of years earlier before syphilis came to that country. So it's an anachronism. Essentially all of the use of or references to syphilis in Shakespeare are anachronisms. In As You Like It, the most mischievous foul sin, brutish sting, embossed sores, license of free foot, wilt thou disgorge into the general war. These are references to syphilis. The Comedy of Errors. Oh, sir, upon her nose, all o'er embellished with rubies, carbuncle, sapphires, declining their rich aspect to the hot breath of Spain, because they didn't want to claim it for Rome. And in the midsummer night's dream, French crowns with alopecia. Troilus and Cressida, which took place at the time of the Trojan War, where there was no syphilis in that part of the world. And they talk about rotten diseases of the south, cold palsies, raw eyes, lime kilns on the palm, and incurable bone ache, which was another word for syphilis. Timon of Athens, the infinite malady. Again, unknown in Greece at the time in which this play is set. Yet he talks again elsewhere about the whore leprosy and a spittle house, which is a VD hospital, and ulcerous sores. Henry V, again, much earlier than syphilis came to that part of the world, where it's referred to by Pistol as the malady of France. And as far as his sonnets, these are full of lasciviousness and sexually transmitted diseases. In 153, Cupid laid by his brand. That was another word for penis, and fell asleep. Made of Dians this advantage found, and his love-kindling fire, holy fire, dateless lively heat, and grew a seething bath, which they knew might do something to help, because in 1539, there was some work with that. Against strange maladies, brand new fired, sad distempered guest, new fire my mistress's eyes. So this is really largely references to syphilis in Shakespeare. W. Somerset Maugham, an Englishman of our time, my time anyway. He wrote a novel called Of Human Bondage in 1915. It tells of the love of a young man, Philip, from Mildred, far below his social station. Mildred is driven to become a prostitute and ultimately dies of syphilis. But in 1904, when they made a movie out of this, the Hayes Commission, which was an ethics commission, forced the change of the script to replace syphilis with tuberculosis, because that was much more acceptable for movie audiences. Censorship. James Joyce, perhaps the greatest poet ever from Ireland. He had familiarity with medicine because he tried to go to medical school several times. He couldn't afford it, and he also didn't have a great aptitude for natural sciences. I kind of identify with this a little. Had many social contacts with medical students, and his monumental work, Ulysses, which I read for a whole semester when I was in college, is an allegory of anatomy and physiology. A principal character in one of his stories in The Dubliners, The Sisters, written in 1904, is a priest, Father James Flynn. In the second version of this story, Joyce implies that Father Flynn has central nervous system syphilis. The paralysis that is used to describe Father Flynn's illness was often used synonymously with general paralysis of the insane, which was what we used to call tertiary syphilis in one form in the early 20th century. And Father Flynn is clearly mad by the end of the story. And this is an article from the Annals of Internal Medicine from quite a few years ago, comparing some descriptions from Osler's work and in The Sisters, one of these stories in the Dublin. I won't go through all of them, but in Osler, in speaking, there is a marked tremulousness of the lips and facial muscles. And in The Sisters, Joyce talks about murmuring voice, lips were so moist with spittle. The tongue is also tremulous and may be protruding with difficulty. When he smiled, he used to let his tongue lie upon his lower lip. And many others. Again, I won't go through all of these. If you wish, you can perhaps get this article. What were some of the treatments of syphilis then and now? Because Dr. K asked, what did they treat it with? And indeed, mercury and guaiac were two very basic treatments when there was nothing else. And there must have been some degree of improvement, or else it would last. And this is a picture showing the use of guaiac in the 16th century. Components of treatments of syphilis in Elizabethan England included hot baths, mercury as a powdered ore, cinnabar, heated to vapor, and then inhaled, or as an ointment applied to the skin, including lesions, and a Spartan diet. Again, in Timon of Athens, they make reference to tubs and baths, the tub fast, and the diet. And in Henry V, the powdering tub of infamy. In World War I, the recommendations were to excise the chancre if possible, otherwise cauterize it or frequently bathe with mercury chloride, magnesium carbonate, zinc oxide, and starch powders. Generally, what was recommended was only 3 drugs: mercury in unctions, iodine as potassium iodide, and arsenic, preferably salvarsan if it were available. And I had mentioned Julius Wagner Jauregg. He was an Austrian physician. He tried to treat syphilis with erysipelas or falciparum malaria in the 19th century because of the fevers, but the results were catastrophic. He introduced Vivax malaria therapy in 1917. He observed clinical improvement or remission in many patients with general paresis of the insane. Mortality was 9%, largely from cardiovascular complications. It happens that this individual is racist and very enthusiastic Nazi. However, in 1927, for his work in pyrotherapy, he was given a Nobel Prize in medicine. That's in a way how revolutionary it was. Current CDC recommendations for treatment. I won't go into too much detail because you probably know a lot more about this than I do. The most recent thing from the CDC that I could find was from 1921 in the most recent update of sexually transmitted infections treatment. And this is available easily on the web at the CDC's website. New York City, about that time, had its own manual. Lubbock, Texas put out the most recent one that I could find. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. And from the CDC's website is this pocket guide for providers for syphilis. Now, the data are scary. We got to do something because not too many years ago, because of an increase in congenital syphilis, the Department of Health and Human Services sent this letter to practicing physicians, telling them, please do something about this. Too many babies are needlessly dying. Only a few years ago. And this was from the CDC's website, just indicating that congenital syphilis is a big problem, but preventable. And these are some data. It's very hard to get current graphs. I don't know whether the current political situation is the cause of this, but I was able to get some data that I just put onto this slide. This slide itself was from 2018. But what it shows is that primary and secondary syphilis in 2023 were very high, almost 53,000, came down a bit in 2024. And this is a little bit more recent, and it shows that there still are increases in syphilis as recent as 2023. The data for 2024 I don't have tabulated. This is just another version of this graph, showing that primary and secondary may be sloping a little bit, early non-primary, non-secondary sloping a little bit, but total still going up. And congenital syphilis, I have more recent data than this. Congenital syphilis went in a period of 10 years from 335 cases to almost 4,000. And it went up again in 2023. And in 2024, it came down a little bit. This is completely preventable. This is, it's again, it's hard to find current maps, but it's really all over the country, congenital syphilis. perhaps a little bit more in this band towards the south and west. This is the more recent map, just syphilis during pregnancy. You can see there are some states that have a greater rate than others. Missed opportunities for preventing congenital syphilis. I'm going to take a couple minutes for this. Non-timely or no documented test in pregnant women. All pregnant women should have the test. Or late identification of seroconversion. Inadequate treatment or no or non-documented treatment. And these are all things that are remediable. We just have to be vigilant. We have to spread the word among our colleagues. Chlamydia is going down, gonorrhea is going down, syphilis, nope. And there was, in fact, an article in the New York Times by a physician from California. How on earth is there a syphilis epidemic in 2024? I think that the distraction of COVID may have had something to do with it, but I just don't know that for sure. Dr. K, what do you think about that? I was in the Navy a long time ago. I had a young man who came in with only thing he knew he had was a swollen lymph node in his inguinal area. But when you examined him the right way, his painless chancre was there. And we actually had a dark field scope in our hospital, and it was crawling with spirochetes. He may be one of the few lives I might have saved by treating his syphilis. It's sometimes very subtle, and it's also very variable. And to make matters worse, there was a shortage of bacillin, and that was really a crisis. And it may be better now. And what the country did, these are just some data that have been supplanted, but I thought it was such an interesting slide. They were importing an equivalent of bacillin from Europe, and that helped to tide us over a little bit. But this document from the Department of Health and Human Services is available online, and it does mention the bacillin shortage. And I won't go over the details of treatment, you all know it. In essence, penicillin is the only drug that really works, and especially for pregnant women, if there's a serious allergy to penicillin, you got to desensitize them. And that isn't always so easy. You may be able to use doxycycline in certain circumstances. And from the Lubbock guide, that's discussed a little bit. You'll have these slides for your review. So I don't want to take, because I'm going to run over. But for pregnant women and neurosyphilis and congenital syphilis, it's only penicillin. And they have to be desensitized and treated with penicillin G if they are allergic. Other instances may be treated with doxycycline, but you got to make sure you got them cured. Azithromycin is not recommended for syphilis because of treatment failures and documented emerging drug resistance. And the last thing we need is for treponema and pallidum to become resistant to antibiotics. Now, what about current epidemiologic nightmares? And there are similarity or differences from syphilis. Epidemiologically, HIV, AIDS, and syphilis are similar. They are transmitted venereally. They are vertical transmission to fetuses. They're transmissible with blood and body fluids. There are clinically latent phases. The societal impact is similar with medical quackery, social isolation, stigmatization of, and discrimination against patients. But untreated syphilis is, quote, cured by the host 75% of the time. Untreated HIV or AIDS usually kills the patient. Antibiotics eliminate treponema pallidum. Antiretrovirals, so far, I think, ameliorate but do not cure HIV or AIDS. But your generation is going to fix that. I'm counting on you. You can't get a better guide than Dr. K. Interventions, including pre-exposure prophylaxis, have reduced overall incidence of new HIV infections, and yet, with very effective therapy, new syphilis cases are increasing. Maybe that's starting to plateau. It impacted the fatal communities and countries through infection of societal leaders. I showed you several monarchs. It impacted social mores by fueling puritanical practices that persist and are an important impetus for public health practices still in use. It had a dramatic and pivotal role in ushering in the antibiotic era. It's largely responsible for the existence of institutional review boards and informed consent. I would like to thank this division to Dr. Bowman and Dr. K for tolerating me, and my beloved, revered mentor, Dr. Donald Armstrong, with whom I was in close contact for 45 years, and still learned from him almost until he died. And above all, my wife, Doris, who puts up with an awful lot of stuff. We just celebrated 50 years together. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I would entertain questions, but I may not be able to answer them. I think people just aren't afraid enough. You agree?
So now people don't know.
I think there's a lot of social apathy.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I hope that I met your expectations. Thank you.